The Draconid Empire stretched across 12 star systems, and every species in the known galaxy knew to bow when the dragon king ships passed overhead Earth and had ruled for 3,000 years. His scale is the color of midnight, his eyes burning with the cold fire of a dying star. And his word was law across more worlds than most beings could count. He had conquered, he had built. He had watched civilizations rise and fall like waves against the shore of his endless reign. But even the Dragon King could not command fate. And fate had delivered him a cruel blow in the form of his youngest child. Prince Cathari had emerged from his egg with scales of pale silver and eyes full of confusion. And within hours, the physicians had delivered their verdict with bowed heads and trembling voices. The prince's neural pathways had failed to form correctly, and his body would never obey his commands. His wings would hang limp, his legs would never carry him, and his life would be one of helpless dependence. Some advisors whispered of the old ways, of mercy killings that spared defective hatchlings from lives of suffering. But Varathkan had refused, though whether from love or pride, none could say so. Prince Cathari lived in the highest tower of Throne Station, surrounded by the finest medical equipment the Empire could provide, attended by Draconid nurses who changed his nutrient tubes and adjusted his hover cradle, and never once looked at him like he was a real person. He was 4 years old now, barely a toddler by Draconid standards. And he had learned that crying brought no comfort, that calling out brought no warmth, that he was something to be maintained rather than loved. And then the humans came. Humanity had stumbled into the galactic community barely 2 centuries ago, their little ships pushing out from a single blue world with more courage than sense. They were small creatures, soft and fragile, with no natural weapons and lifespans so short that other species found it almost tragic. The integration wars had taught them their place, and now they served throughout the Empire in roles that no self-respecting species would accept. They cleaned, they maintained. They fixed things and carried things and disappeared into the background of galactic civilization. Like ghosts. Myra Chen was 26 years old, which meant she had already lived more than a quarter of her expected lifespan. And she had spent the last 3 years working as a cleaning maid on Throne Station. She had scrubbed floors in the administrative sectors and polished windows in the diplomatic halls, and never once complained. Because complaining was not something humans did when they were surrounded by beings who could crush them with a thought. When she was reassigned to the prince's quarters, she understood it was not an honor. The previous maid had quit after the young prince had screamed for 6 hours straight one night, his translator broadcasting distress calls that no one answered because the nurses said he needed to learn independence. Mira was expected to clean around him, to empty the waste receptacles and sanitize the medical equipment, and pretend the small dragon in the hover cradle did not exist on her first night. She did exactly that, keeping her eyes down and her movements quiet as the prince watched her with those strange silver eyes. On her second night, she noticed that his nutrient tube was positioned wrong, pressing against his scales in a way that must have been uncomfortable. But she did not touch him, because humans were not allowed to touch royal blood. On her third night, she found him on the floor. The hover cradle had malfunctioned, tilting slowly until the prince had slid out and landed on the cold metal deck, his nutrient tube disconnected, his small body shivering in the station's regulated atmosphere that was comfortable for adult Draconids but far too cold for a hatchling. His translator was crying out for help in 12 languages. But the nurses' quarters were 3 levels up, and their shift had ended 4 hours ago, and no one was coming. Myra stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. Then she crossed the room and knelt beside the prince, and her hands were lifting him before her mind could remind her of all the reasons this was forbidden. He was lighter than she expected, his scales smooth and cool against her skin, and when she cradled him against her chest, she could feel the rapid flutter of his heart. "Okay," she whispered. A voice, the first kind sound he had heard in months. "Okay, little one, I have you. You are safe now." She reconnected the nutrient tube with careful fingers. Having watched the nurses do it enough times to understand the mechanism, and then she looked around for something to warm him, but there was nothing. Draconids did not use blankets, their scales providing all the insulation they needed. And the medical equipment offered no comfort, so Mira did the only thing she could think of. And she pressed the small prince against her chest, against the place where her heart beat steady and strong beneath her ribs. Human body temperature ran high by galactic standards, a furnace burning at 37 degrees. And Myra's body heat began to seep into the shivering hatchling. Prince Kethari went still for a long moment. Mira thought something was wrong, that she had somehow hurt him, and fear seized her chest, but then she felt him relax, his small body unclenching for what might have been the first time in his life. And a sound emerged from his throat that the translator did not need to interpret. He was purring. Myra held him for 3 hours, humming songs her grandmother had taught her, songs about mountains and rivers and a blue world she had never seen. And when the prince finally fell asleep, it was without the medication that usually forced his eyes closed. She put him back in the hover cradle before the nurses arrived, fixed the malfunction with a simple reset she had learned from a mechanic friend, and finished her cleaning as if nothing had happened. The prince watched her go with silver eyes that held something new in their depths. The next night, Mira found the hover cradle deliberately tilted, the prince waiting on the floor with his translator silent and his gaze fixed on the door. He had learned how to fall, and he had learned that if he fell, the warm creature would hold him. Myra knew she should report the malfunction, should let the nurses handle this, should remember her place in the order of things. Instead, she crossed the room and lifted him again. And when his small claws gripped her uniform and his head pressed against her heartbeat, she made a decision that would change the fate of 2 species. She would keep coming back, she would keep holding him, and she would never tell a soul. 6 weeks passed in secret, and something was changing inside Prince Kethari that no Draconid physician had ever predicted. Every night, Mira would finish her cleaning duties in the royal quarters, and every night the young prince would be waiting for her. His hover cradle tilted just enough to let him slide to the floor. She would lift him, and he would press against her chest. And for hours they would exist together in a bubble of warmth that the cold universe could not touch. Mira and started talking to him during these sessions, telling him about her life and her world and the strange journey that had brought her to Throne Station. She told him about Earth, a planet so far away that its light would take centuries to reach the Draconid home systems. A world of blue oceans and green forests and a single yellow sun. She told him about her family, her parents who had died in the integration wars, her brother who had emigrated to a mining colony and sent messages twice a year, her grandmother who had raised her on stories and songs and the stubborn human belief that tomorrow could always be better than today. The prince listened to everything, his silver eyes wide with wonder, because no one had ever talked to him like he was a person before. And then one night, he talked back. "Myra," he said, his translator rendering the word in her language with careful precision. "Why is your body so warm?" Myra smiled and shifted him slightly in her arms, making sure his nutrient tube was not tangled. "Humans are just like that," she said. "We burn hot, like little furnaces walking around. My grandmother used to say it was because we had fire in our hearts." "Fire," the prince repeated, as if tasting the word. "I like fire. I like your fire. Well, you can borrow it whenever you need it," Myra said. And she pressed a gentle kiss to the top of his head before she could think better of it. The prince went very still, and then he made that purring sound again, and his tail twitched against her arm. Myra froze. His tail had twitched in 4 years of life. Prince Kethari had never moved his tail voluntarily, had never sent a signal from his brain to his extremities that actually arrived at its destination. But his tail had twitched, and as Mira held her breath, it twitched again. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, and the prince nodded, his eyes suddenly bright with tears. "I felt it," he said. "Myra, I felt it. I made it move. I did that." Over the following weeks, the twitches became more frequent and more controlled, and Mira began to suspect that something about their nightly sessions was doing more than just providing comfort. She was not a scientist, but she was observant, and she had noticed that the prince's improvements always came during or immediately after their time. Together, the warmth seemed to help. The steady rhythm of her heartbeat seemed to help. And the simple fact that someone was touching him with kindness seemed to help. Most of all, Myra needed to talk to someone who understood bodies and machines and how things worked. And she knew exactly who to call. Tomas Reyes worked in the maintenance levels of Throne Station, 12 decks down from the gleaming towers where the nobility lived, in a maze of pipes and cables and machinery that kept the whole station running. Had served in the human territorial fleet during the last years of the Integration Wars, flying combat missions against Draconid fighters until a peace treaty had ended the conflict and left him without a purpose. Now he fixed coolant systems and replaced worn conduits and tried not to think about the friends he had lost and the sister who had not survived the bombardment of the Santiago colony when Mira called him on a secure channel and asked him to meet her in Maintenance Bay 12. He assumed she had broken something and needed help covering it up. He did not expect her to arrive carrying the Dragon King's son. "Are you completely insane?" Tomas said, his voice flat with shock as Mira stepped through the door with the small dragon cradled against her chest. "Probably," Myra admitted, "but I need your help, and I did not know who else to ask." She told him everything about the fallen prince and the nightly visits and the tail that had learned to twitch. And Tomas listened with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable when she finished. He was silent for a long moment. "You know what they did to us," he finally said. "The Draconids, you know what they did during the war. My sister was on Santiago when they bombed it. She was 12 years old." "I know," Myra said quietly. "I lost my parents at Kepa Station. I know exactly what they did." "Then why?" Tomas demanded, gesturing at the prince, who was watching him with curious silver eyes. "Why risk everything for one of them?" Mira looked down at the child in her arms, at the thin limbs and the limp wings and the face that had never known a gentle touch until she came along. "Because he is a child," she said simply. "Because he was hurting and no one was helping him. Because I could not walk away and still be the person my grandmother raised me to be." Tomas stared at her for a long time. Then he looked at the prince, really looked at him, and saw not the species that had killed his sister, but a broken child who had never asked to be born into a body that did not work. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice rough. Myra smiled, and the prince made a small, hopeful sound. "He can move his tail now, but just barely, and only when I am holding him," she explained. "I think my body heat is helping somehow. Or maybe my heartbeat. I do not understand the science. But I think if we could find a way to support his body, to help him stand and move while he is getting stronger, he might actually be able to walk someday." Tomas was quiet, his engineer's mind turning the problem over. "An exophrum," he finally said. "A mechanical support structure. We use them for heavy lifting. But I could miniaturize the design, adapt it for his body type." "Can you build it?" Myra asked. Tomas looked around the maintenance bay at the salvaged parts and discarded machinery that filled every corner. "I can build anything," he said. And for the first time since his sister died, something like hope flickered in his eyes. The prince watched the human mechanic with fascination as Tomas began pulling parts from storage bins, already sketching designs in his mind. "You are going to help me," Cathari said, His translator carrying the wonder in his voice, Thomas knelt down to look the prince in the eye. "Yeah, little guy," he said, "I am going to help you. And if anyone tries to stop us, they will have to go through me first." The prince reached out with one trembling claw and touched the human's chest. Feeling the same warmth, the same steady heartbeat that Myra carried. "Thank you," he whispered, and Tomas, who had sworn never to forgive the Draconid race, found his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. "Do not thank me yet," he said gruffly. "We have a lot of work to do." Tomas worked through every free hour he had for the next 3 months, building something that had never existed before. The Exorfrom started as a rough sketch on a stained maintenance tablet, a simple idea of metal supports that could hold a small body upright. But it grew into something far more complex. As Tomas learned more about Draconid physiology, he salvaged parts from everywhere, pulling servo motors from decommissioned, cleaning drones and harvesting flexible joints from medical equipment that had been marked for recycling, traded favors with other human workers in the lower decks, mechanics and electricians and engineers who asked no questions when he requested unusual components. None of them knew what he was building, but they helped anyway, because humans helped each other. It was simply what they did. The biggest challenge was the power source, Draconid. Technology ran on crystalline matrices that converted ambient radiation into energy. But Tomas had no access to such advanced systems. And even if he did, he would not know how to use them. Instead, he invented something new. The human body generated heat constantly, burning calories and radiating warmth into the surrounding air. And Tomas figured out how to capture that heat and convert it into electrical power. The thermoelectric generator he built was crude by galactic standards, just a series of specialized materials that produced current when exposed to temperature differences. But it worked as long as the prince stayed close to a human, as long as he borrowed their fire. His Exorfrom would never run out of power. Myra brought Catherine down to the maintenance bay twice a week now, timing their visits to coincide with the gaps in security patrol schedules that Tomas had memorized. Prince was fascinated by everything in the human's workshop, by the tools and the machines and the way Tomas could look at a broken thing and understand exactly how to make it work again. "Your people build things," Catherine observed one night, watching Tomas weld a joint with careful precision. "That is what we do," Tomas agreed without looking up from his work. "We see problems and we build solutions. It is how we survived on Earth, building shelters and tools and machines to overcome every challenge nature threw at us. Draconids do not build," the prince said thoughtfully. "We command, we rule. We take what we need from lesser species and make them serve us." Tomas paused his welding and looked at the small dragon. "Is that what you want to do when you grow up? Take things and command people?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, his silver eyes distant. "I want to walk," he finally said. "I want to fly. I want to run and play and do all the things that other Draconid children do. I do not care about commanding anyone. I just want to move." Tomas smiled, and it softened his weathered face. "Then let us make that happen." The first test of the Exorfrom came on a night when the station's environmental systems were being serviced, and most of the upper decks were empty. Mira carried the prince down to the maintenance bay as usual. But this time, Tomas was waiting with a strange contraption of metal and wire spread out on his workbench. "It is not pretty," Tomas admitted, holding up the frame so they could see it, "but it should work. The supports will hold his body upright, and the servo motors will amplify any movements he makes. So even if his signals are weak, the frame will help complete the motion." Myra set the prince down on the bench, and together she and Tomas began fitting the Exorfrom around his small body. It took nearly an hour to get everything positioned correctly, to adjust the straps and calibrate the servos, and connect the thermoelectric generator to a small battery pack. When they finished, Cathari looked like something from a human science fiction story. His silver scales wrapped in a cage of dark metal. His limbs supported by mechanical joints that hummed with quiet power. "Okay," Tomas said, stepping back. "Myra, hold him steady while I activate the frame." Myra placed her hands on the prince's shoulders, and Tomas pressed a button on a small control unit. The exorphrum whirred to life, and Cathari gasped as he felt the servos take some of his weight. "Now try to stand," Tomas instructed. "Do not think too hard about it. Just imagine yourself standing up, and let the frame help." The prince closed his eyes, and his face twisted with concentration. And for a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then his legs moved. It was jerky and awkward. More machine than muscle, but his legs actually moved, pushing against the workbench, lifting his body. And suddenly Prince Cathari was standing for the first time in his life. Myra caught her breath, and Tomas let out a whoop of triumph that echoed through the bay. "I'm standing," Cathari whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I am standing up. I am doing it. Look at me. I am standing." He looked at his two humans with eyes full of tears. And then he did something that Draconid children almost never did. Something that was considered beneath the dignity of their proud species. He laughed. The sound rang through the maintenance bay like music, high and pure and full of joy, and Mira found herself laughing too. And even Tomas had to wipe his eyes. They practiced every night after that, pushing the prince's limits a little further each time. First he learned to stand without holding on to anything, then to take a single step, then 2 steps, then 3. He fell constantly, his uncoordinated limbs tangling with the exorphrum, but Myra was always there to catch him, and Tomas was always there to adjust the servos and try. Again, the prince learned other things during those long nights in the maintenance bay. He learned that Tomas had lost his sister in the war and still carried that grief like a stone in his chest. Learned that Mira had nightmares about the station bombardment that had killed her parents. Dreams where she could hear the alarms and smell the burning and feel the floor shake beneath her feet. He learned that humans were not the simple creatures his tutors had described, not mere servants fit only for menial labor, but complex beings with histories and hopes and hearts that burned with fire even when the universe gave them every reason to grow cold. "Why do you help me?" he asked one night, resting against Tomas's chest while the mechanic recharged the exorphrum battery. "Your people have every reason to hate mine. We conquered you. We killed your families. We treat you like you are nothing." Tomas was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the prince's head. "Because you are not your empire," he finally said. "You are a kid who wanted to walk, and I could help, so I did. That is all there is to it. But it is dangerous," Cathari pressed. "If they find out what you are doing, they will kill you, probably." Tomas agreed. "Then why?" Tomas looked down at the small dragon curled against his warmth, and he thought about his sister. And he thought about all the years he had spent carrying hatred like a shield. "Because my sister would have wanted me to," he said softly. "She was kind, kinder than me, and if she had found a hurting child who needed help, she would not have cared what species he was. She would have helped him. And I want to be more like her." Cathari listened to the steady beat of the human's heart and made a silent promise whatever happened next. He would make sure these two soft, fragile, impossible creatures were protected. He would make sure the galaxy knew what they had done for him. He would make sure humans were never treated as nothing again. The prince's progress could not stay hidden forever, and it was his own growing strength that finally gave them. Away 9 months had passed since Myra first lifted the crying child from the cold floor, and in that time Cathari had transformed from a helpless invalid into something that defied all medical expectations. He could walk now. Really walk, not just shuffle with mechanical assistance, but actually coordinate his legs and move with something approaching grace. His wings had started to respond too, twitching and fluttering when he concentrated, and Tomas was already working on an extension to the exophrum that would help him achieve true flight someday. But it was his tail that betrayed them during a formal audience in the throne room, where the prince was required to sit in his hover cradle and be seen by visiting dignitaries. Cathari moved his wing. He did not mean to do it. It was just an automatic response to an itch. But the wing that had hung limp since birth suddenly lifted and adjusted and settled back down like it had done it 1,000 times before. The visiting ambassador stopped mid-sentence. The court physicians, who had been standing in their ceremonial positions along the wall, rushed forward with scanners and diagnostic equipment. Within an hour, they had discovered traces of unfamiliar metals in the prince's scales, alloys that did not match any draconid manufacturing process, compounds that their databases identified as human in origin within 2 hours. They had accessed the station's security logs and found anomalies in the patrol schedules around the maintenance levels, gaps that had been exploited repeatedly over the past 9 months. Within 3 hours, they had cross-referenced personnel records and identified 2 human workers who had accessed unauthorized areas during the relevant time periods. Myra Chan, cleaning staff assigned to the Royal Quarters. Thomas Reyes, maintenance technician, assigned to Deck 12 by evening. Both humans were in custody. The guards came for Mira first, dragging her from her quarters without explanation. And when she saw Tomas being brought in from the opposite direction with blood on his face from where he had resisted, she knew their secret was finally exposed. They were taken to the throne room, not the formal audience chamber, but the private court where the Dragon King held judgment on matters too sensitive for public view. Khan sat upon his throne like a mountain of midnight scales, his eyes burning with cold fire, and around him stood his advisors and physicians and guards, all watching the 2 small humans with expressions of contempt and curiosity. So, the Dragon King said, his voice filling the chamber like thunder, "These are the creatures who dared to touch my son." Myra stood as straight as she could manage, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Yes, Your Majesty, I touched him." "You?" Varath Khan leaned forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "A human, a servant, a member of a conquered species that exists only because we permit it to exist. You presume to lay hands on the blood of the dragon throne." "He was cold," Myra said. "He had fallen from his cradle, and his nutrient tube was disconnected, and he was crying." "Your Majesty, he was crying and no one was coming to help him. And you," the Dragon King turned his terrible gaze on Tomas. "You built machinery for him, devices of human design, without authorization, without oversight, without any understanding of the damage you might cause." Tomas met the ancient eyes without flinching. He wanted to walk. He said simply, "Every kid wants to walk. So I built him something that let him do it." "You had no right," one of the physicians interjected. "Human medicine is primitive. Your technology is crude. You could have killed him with your interference." "Could have," Tomas agreed. "But I did not. He is stronger now than he has ever been. And that is more than any of you accomplished in 4 years of standing around and telling his father there was no hope." The physician sputtered with outrage. "But the Dragon King raised one massive claw, and silence fell. "The penalty for touching royal blood without permission is death," Varath Khan said, his voice flat and final. "The penalty for unauthorized medical intervention on a member of the royal family is death. The penalty for conspiracy to deceive the throne is death. You have committed all 3 offenses." Myra felt Tomas shift beside her, felt him preparing to fight, even though they both knew it was hopeless. And then the doors of the throne room burst open. Prince Cathari walked through them on his own 2 legs. He was wearing his exophrum openly for the first time, the human-made machinery visible against his silver scales. And he moved with a confidence that made every draconid in the room stare in disbelief. Behind him came 2 of his nurses, their faces pale with shock. clearly having failed to stop him. Cathari. The Dragon King breathed, and for the first time in 3,000 years, his voice held something like uncertainty. The prince crossed the throne room, step by steady step, until he stood before his father's throne. "They did not deceive you," Cathari said, his young voice carrying through the silent chamber. "They saved me. For 4 years, I lay in that cradle and waited to die. For 4 years, your physicians and your nurses and your advisors told you I was broken beyond repair. And then Mira held me and Tomas built me legs, and now I am walking, Father. Look at me. I am walking." The humans acted without permission, an advisor said. "Regardless of the outcome, the law is clear. Then the law is wrong." The prince shot back and his wings fluttered with agitation. Actually moved for the first time in front of witnesses. Gasps echoed through the chamber. "Father," Cathari continued, turning back to the Dragon King, "they fixed me when everyone else gave up. They came to me night after night and held me and taught me and believed I could be more than a broken thing in a hover cradle. And if you kill them for that, I will never forgive you. You are a child," an advisor sneered. "You do not understand the implications of what you ask." "I understand that they love me," the prince said, and his voice broke on the word. "I understand that they risked everything to help me when they had every reason to hate me. I understand that they are the only beings in this entire empire who ever looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem." He turned to face the full court, his silver eyes blazing. "If this is what the Draconid Empire does," he said, "if we kill the people who show kindness, if we execute those who help the helpless, then I am ashamed to be part of it." The silence that followed was absolute. The Dragon King stared at his son, at the child who had never been expected to stand, who had never been expected to speak with such fire, who had never been expected to become anything at all, and something in those ancient eyes began to shift. "Leave us," Vorathkan commanded, and his voice left no room for argument. "All of you leave now, except for the humans and my son." The court emptied in seconds. Advisors and physicians and guards fleeing before the Dragon King's wrath. And then it was just the 4 of them in that vast and echoing chamber. Vorathkan descended from his throne. He had not left that elevated seat in centuries, had not lowered himself to stand on the same level as lesser beings in longer than most species had existed. But now he came down the steps and crossed the floor until he stood before the 2 humans who had refused to look away. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "Tell me everything, from the beginning, and do not lie to me." Myra looked at Tomas, and Tomas looked at Mira, and then she began to speak. She told him about the fallen prince and the disconnected tube and the cold that was killing him. Slowly she told him about the first time she held Cathari against her chest and felt him relax. She told him about Tomas and the Exorphrum and the long nights of practice and failure and practice. Again she told him about the fire in human hearts, the stubborn warmth that would not go out no matter how cold the universe became. And when she finished, the Dragon King was silent for a very long time. The Dragon King stood in the empty throne room, surrounded by 3,000 years of conquest and power, and looked at the 2 small beings who had done what his entire empire could not. Marichan met his gaze without flinching. Though she knew that a single word from him could end her existence, Thomas Reyes stood beside her with his jaw set and his fists clenched, ready to fight even though they both knew how pointless it would be. And Prince Cathari watched his father with silver eyes full of hope and fear and something that might have been love. "My physicians told me my son would never walk," Vorathkan finally said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "My advisors told me his life would be one of suffering, that the merciful path was clear, that I should end his existence before it became a burden to the throne." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was heavy with an emotion that Draconids rarely expressed. "For 4 years, I believed them. For 4 years, I kept my distance from my own child, because I could not bear to love something I would eventually have to lose for 4 years. I let him suffer alone because I was too proud to admit that I was afraid. The Dragon King lowered his massive head until his eyes were level with Myra's, and then a cleaning maid held him against her chest, and a mechanic built him legs from garbage. And my son walked into my throne room under his own power, and I realized that everything I believed was wrong. He straightened and turned to address the empty chamber. Though Myra understood he was speaking to something larger than the four of them. To history itself, the galaxy has dismissed humans as weak, Varathkan said, his voice rising with each word. We have called them fragile, primitive, insignificant. We have conquered their worlds and taken their resources and treated them as servants fit only for menial labor. And in our arrogance, we have missed what they truly are. He spread his wings wide, a gesture that signified royal decree throughout the Draconid Empire. They are the species that looks at the broken and says, I can fix that. They are the species that holds crying children regardless of whose children they are. They are the species that builds miracles from scraps because someone needed help and no one else was coming. Prince Cathari moved to stand beside his father, his small form dwarfed by the Dragon King's immensity, but his presence lending weight to the moment. My son lives because two humans cared when no one else did. Varathkan continued. He walks because they refused to accept that walking was impossible. He stands before me now because they had the courage to break every law of our empire in pursuit of simple kindness. The Dragon King turned back to face Myra and Tomas. I will not execute you, he said. I will not punish you. Instead, I will reward you in a way that has never been done in the history of the Draconid Empire. He raised his voice, activating the recording systems that would broadcast his words across every station and ship and planet under his rule by royal decree. Mara Chen is hereby appointed royal guardian to Prince Cathari, first of her station, with all the rights and privileges that title conveys. She will be responsible for his care and his education and his well-being, and any who harm her will answer to the dragon throne itself. Mira felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. Tomas Reyes, the Dragon King continued, is hereby granted the title of Imperial Engineer, First Class, with full access to all resources and facilities necessary to continue his work. He will lead a new division dedicated to developing assistive technologies for those who have been deemed beyond help, and his methods will be studied and replicated across the empire. Tomas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Furthermore, Varathkan said, every physician who told me my son was beyond saving will present themselves to the throne within one standard day. They will explain to me in detail why they failed where two humans with no training succeeded, and they will accept whatever consequences I deem appropriate. The broadcast ended, and the Dragon King's wings folded back against his body. I have ruled for 3,000 years, he said quietly, speaking now only to the four of them. I have conquered worlds and crushed rebellions and built an empire that spans the stars. I have been called many things, wise and terrible and ancient beyond measure. But I have never been called a good father. He looked at his son, and for the first time, Mira saw something vulnerable in those ancient eyes. I would like to learn, Varathkan said. If you will teach me. Cathari crossed the distance between them and pressed himself against his father's chest, feeling the massive heart beat slow and steady beneath those midnight scales. I will teach you, the prince said, and Mira and Tomas will help. The Dragon King wrapped his wings around his son, and Mira found herself crying, the tears running down her face. Without shame, Tomas put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the throne room of the most powerful being in 12 star systems. And they understood that everything was about to change. 3 years later, Prince Cathari stood before the Galactic Council. He had grown since that night in the throne room, his silver scales now bright with health, his wings strong enough to carry him through the air. His legs steady and sure beneath him, the exophrum was still visible around his body, but it had been refined into something elegant. A fusion of human engineering and draconid biotechnology that represented the best of both species. Mira sat in the audience beside Tomas, both of them wearing the formal attire of their new positions. And they watched as the child they had saved prepared to speak. "I come before you today," Cathari said, his voice carrying through the vast chamber, "to propose the elevation of humanity to major species status within the Galactic Council." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates, representatives of 100 species who had long dismissed humans as beneath their notice. "I know what many of you think of humans," the prince continued. "I know you consider them weak and fragile and primitive. I know you believe they have nothing to offer a galaxy of elder races. But I stand before you as proof that you are wrong." He gestured to Myra and Tomas. "These two humans saved my life. They looked at a broken child that their own people had every reason to hate. And they chose kindness over vengeance, compassion over indifference, love over law." His voice rose with passion. "That is what humans do. They find the lost and broken things of the universe, and they fix them. They see suffering, and they cannot look away. They have so little time, so few years to live compared to most of you. And yet they spend those precious years helping others." Cathari spread his wings, the wings that should never have moved, and the chamber fell silent. "I move that humanity be granted full voting rights, full territorial protections, and full recognition as a major species of the Galactic Council. And I call for an immediate vote." The vote passed unanimously later that night, in the quarters they now shared in the draconid royal palace. Mira and Tomas sat together watching the news coverage of the historic decision. "Well," Tomas said, leaning back in his chair, "that is one way to change the galaxy." Myra laughed softly. "We just did what needed doing," she said. "Yeah," Tomas smiled. "That is what humans do." The door opened, and Cathari came in, still wearing his formal robes. His face tired but happy without a word. He crossed the room and settled between them, pressing against Myra's side and resting his head on Tomas's shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for saving me, for staying with me, for helping me become someone who could stand up there and speak." Myra stroked his head the way she had done 1,000 times before. "You did the hard part," she said. "We just held you up until you could stand on your own. That is what parents do," Cathari said. And the word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Tomas's arm tightened around the young prince. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I guess it is." Outside the window, the stars stretched endlessly across the void, cold and distant and indifferent to the small, warm creatures who lived beneath them. But in that room, in that moment, 3 beings from 2 different species sat together in the light of a small lamp. And they knew that sometimes the smallest kindnesses could reshape the universe. They knew that love was stronger than law, that compassion was mightier than conquest, that the fire in human hearts could warm even the coldest corners of creation. And they knew that tomorrow, whatever challenges it brought, they would face it together, the way families do, the way humans do always.